Hello, this is Dr. Goodin, Causal Factors and Viewpoints. All right, we're going to look at clusters of symptoms. You need to know the word etiology, which means a causal pattern. What causes the disorder? You might want to look at page 36, figure 2, in order to understand the difference between necessary, sufficient, and contributory cause. For necessary cause, that means it must be present. If Y happens, if Y is there, then X will happen. But it must be present. X cannot happen without Y, and vice versa. So syphilis must be there with general paresis. A sufficient cause is a little bit different. If X, then Y, but if a different X, then you can still get the result, Y. So hopelessness is a sufficient cause for depression, but there could be other causes that could be sufficient. Contributory causes, if X, then Y is more likely, but it's not necessary to have X. In fact, X alone may not cause Y. Whereas, so this is like parental neglect may contribute to depression later in life. So in terms of effect time, we're talking about short or long, basically. Short means we have a proximal cause, like death or grieving, and a long-term, a short-term end result. And it happens very quickly from one to the other. Long effect time is you have a distal cause. Early on, you might have parental neglect in your childhood, and later on, many years down the road, it leads to adult depression. Then sometimes we have two-way influences where depression can lead to marital levels of marital happiness or unhappiness, and vice versa. Marital unhappiness can lead to depression. You need to understand the diathesis stress model, which we have here. Basically, a diathesis is a predisposition for something. So predisposition can include your biology, your psychology, how you're built socially. It's a vulnerability, and some have more of this vulnerability, this diathesis, than others. So it requires less stress on them to cause problems. And that being said, socially, or as part of our family, we might have protective factors as well, or even as part of our personality. These protective factors basically work against the diathesis, work against the vulnerability, decreasing the likelihood that we will get illness X or disease Y. So a warm and supportive family would be a protective factor in most cases. It builds resilience through previous tough times, sometimes. And we refer to this as overcoming the odds. So now we're going to break down a little bit more protective processes and think about that in contrast to risk factors. So risk factors added to protective processes. So you kind of balance those out. And then add on stressors, and that's basically going to be a sort of equation for your mental health. When we study developmental psychopathology, we try to determine what is normal or abnormal. A child being scared of the dark is normal, for instance, in terms of development, whereas a teen scared of the dark might be considered abnormal, might be called a phobia. We're going to look at psychological viewpoints. More and more psychological viewpoints on abnormal behavior have come about, but there are three main viewpoints that conflict and complement each other. The first is psychodynamic, second is behavioral, and the third is cognitive behavioral. All right, so talking about psychodynamic perspectives, we have Freud with the psychoanalytic school of thought. He emphasized the role of unconscious motives and thoughts and their dynamic interrelationships in the determination of normal or abnormal behavior. And he actually believed that the unconscious was a greater force than the conscious. It seeks expression through fantasies, dreams, slips of the tongue, which we call Freudian slips. Psychoanalysis was his method of therapy. It helps integrate the unconscious material into the conscious until that integration occurs. We have maladaptive behavior and irrational behavior. So the fundamentals of Freud's psychoanalytic theory are kind of based on the structure of personality that he proposed. You've heard of these: the id, the ego, the superego. The id is sort of life instincts. You might even think of libido or death instincts such as aggression or destruction. So sexual instincts, searching for anything pleasurable, not just coitus, but anything that is pleasurable to the body. It operates on the pleasure principle. Selfish, pleasure-oriented behavior, immediate gratification of instinctual needs, and we definitely have a deficit or inattention to reality or morals. So perhaps just for you to make sure you're learning, you might think about how the id plays a role in our society and even in your personal life. How much of what you do would you say, according to Freud's structure of personality, how much of what you do and how much of your life is controlled by the id? And compare, where you are now to where you were maybe when you were 13 or 18, something like that. Of course, the ego mediates id demands and reality. It says, well, you want to go, you want that new television, but you don't actually have any money. It requires reason, intellect, exercise of control, secondary process thinking, and it operates on the reality principle. It's often guided by this third one we're going to talk about, the superego, which is sort of evidence of our societal rules and expectations are right and wrong. We often internalize the taboos and moral values of our society. You might think, if you're old enough, you might think of the conscious, or conscience, I should say, as being Jiminy Cricket. So the ego mediates both the id, which is sort of the liberal side of us, the wants to progress and do fun things, and I hate to make that political. It's not meant to be political. And then the superego, which is more of a conservative, cautious, um, and they both we the it is not bad. It's not purely sinful or wrong or um, we need pleasure in our lives in order to be happy people. Um, doesn't always mean sex. We just need some fun things, and we also need some caution in order to stay safe. So all three, the id, the ego, the superego, have different goals. If unresolved, it leads to intrapsychic conflicts and mental disorder. Anxiety is overt or manifested in other overt symptoms when repressed. It warns of impending real or imagined danger and helps us take corrective action. Neurotic anxiety isn't rational, thus the term neurotic. Ego uses irrational protection. Um, we might use defense mechanisms. So here we're going to touch on the psychosexual stages of development that Freud talked about. Oral stage involves the mouth, is evidenced by sucking behaviors, putting fingers or rocks or marbles in one's mouth. It's normally 0 to 2 years of age. Secondly, the anal stage of development, where the main part of the body emphasized is the anus. And here we have evidence through retention or elimination of bodily waste. This is during 2 to 3 years of age. The phallic stage is 3 to 6 years of age, and it's focused on the genitals, and not necessarily in a sexual way. This is just more curiosity and discovery of the genitals. The latency stage is from 6 to 12 years of age. This is sort of after discovery of the genitals, we have sort of a time, a latent time. In other words, a passive time, less sexual, working on other skills, making friends with same sex. Of course, until the last stage, which is the genital stage, where sexual relations become more emphasized. This is 13 years of age and older normally. This is, of course, a little younger in our society, becoming more and more younger, probably due to societal implications, but also biological changes. So viewpoints on causes are, we have uncertainty, which adds complexity. And many viewpoints converge in research and articles, but uncertainty is a generally accepted view. Then there's the biopsychosocial viewpoint. So the biological viewpoint, we might think about alcohol and behavior. Look at 4 factors here if you want, page 39. We have neurotransmitters and hormones. We have genetics. We have temperament, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Brain dysfunction and neuroplasticity. These I just want you to understand that we have sort of we can explain many things due to our biology, our genetic makeup. And under that heading, of course, we'd have neurotransmitters and hormones. Think of your synapses, your neurotransmitters. Psychological stress can impact neurotransmitter functioning. And hormones involves the endocrine system. These are called our chemical messengers. And it will affect growth, your fight or your flight choices, your sexual responses. Remember that your pituitary gland is called, it is known as your master gland. And we also get into the HPA axis, which we'll talk about more later on. But we're going to think about adrenaline and the role it plays. Cortisol, which is sort of a stress hormone, and we're going to think about it as a sort of a thermostat where there's a feedback loop. So when it gets too hot, the air conditioning comes on, so to speak. When it gets too cold, the heat comes on, and our hormones react in a similar way. When we get too stressed, we might release a certain hormone to counteract. Genetics, we're talking about genes, of course, long molecules of DNA within the chromosomes. The manifestation is sometimes in adolescence or adulthood of these genetic predispositions. Abnormalities in genes are called polymorphisms, and a lot of diseases are polygenetic. In other words, they involve multiple genes. And stress can turn on or off the genes. So we get stressed, and that diathesis is sort of flipped on. That vulnerability is taken advantage of, and we may have a panic attack or something like that. A genotype is the total genetic setup that we have. A phenotype involves the characteristics resulting from interaction of the genotype and our environment. Phenotype can also affect the environment. This leads us to the genotype-environment correlation. Different people with different genotypes respond in different ways to the environment, of course. And when we have a genetic predisposition, say for depression, we respond differently to stress. A passive effect sort of fits in. Genetically similar to parents, high intelligence. An evocative sort of correlation is active, happy, and gets more positive environmental responses. And then we have a third type, active. Active is niche building. An extroverted child may seek company, and this increases sociability. In terms of genetic influence, I want to touch on that a bit more. Behavioral genetics, we're talking about family history. We could study this with family history, the twin studies or twin methods, and adoption studies. So with family history, we're talking about limitation with the fact that they also share a similar environment. With the twin method, concordance rate should be 100%, but the disorder is not just genetic. So this is a way that we can test the genetic influence. But we need to realize that there are other influences besides genetic. We often would, however, compare identical twins to fraternal twins. And then the adoption method is really interesting. We compare one sibling with another, one sibling with a disorder to another without the disorder, and the emphasis is on if parents had a disorder and what happened. Because normally in adoption, they are receiving a different environment than the other child, depending on how the adoption worked. We get into linkage analysis, or LA, and association studies, or AS, which are just ways that scientists try to locate genes responsible for things. With LA, it's monogene, in other words, one gene, like eye color, chromosomes. May look into mental disorder for nearsightedness or and just various things that you can look at with LA for linkage studies. And with association studies, we use multiple genes, or polygene. It's more disordered. We have a control and treatment group, and we compare the genetic markers. With regard to temperament, we have the child's reactivity and characteristic ways of self-regulation. Now this is a child, a newborn to toddler perhaps. This is basically a personality that is not yet fully formed. It leads to personality, as you see here. Genetics and environment, and it results in that personality. There are 5 dimensions. At this level of temperament, we have fearfulness, irritability and frustration, positive affect, which means positive emotion, activity level, and then attentional, persistence, and effortful control. All right. Now, these are related to some personality traits later in life: neuroticism, which is negative emotionality, extroversion, which is positive emotionality, and constraint, which is conscientiousness and perhaps agreeableness. Of course, our temperament interacts with the environment. A child that is difficult to get along with will get more negative reactions from the environment that they are in, and the environment will sort of react in negative ways, and the child will cry more or become more unruly or become more depressed and develop a more depressive personality perhaps. They may be behaviorally inhibited, fearful of unfamiliar situations, and this could later lead to anxiety disorders, something like that. Uninhibited might lead to delinquency, maybe a difficulty with moral standards. Next, we're going to look into brain dysfunction and neural plasticity, the flexibility of the brain to organize and function. The developmental systems approach acknowledges genetics, neural activity, behavior, and behavioral neural activity. Basically, what we want to focus on are how neural circuits are modified or created and can be beneficial or detrimental. It really depends on the circumstances. Then we have prenatal and postnatal experiences, which both have an effect. And then the environment can be unstimulating or depriving. This will retard or slow human development. Other things that may be influential are psychotropic drugs, which emphasize the biological viewpoint. Psychological treatments may still have just as much influence, however. The Oedipus complex, I want to touch on that before I get too far. It involves a fear, and basically that fear is, in this case, castration anxiety. The Oedipus complex sort of describes a situation in which all young males are sexually attracted to their mothers, but since their mothers are already claimed by their fathers, and they have fear of conflict with their father, they have fear of being castrated, for instance, according to Freud. So they side with their father. They try to become more like their father, hypothetically, in order to find another woman who is like their own mother. And that sounds really creepy and messed up, but as you're listening to this, you may think about your current wife or husband or whatever you're into and realize how similar. It's not always the case, but often I've dated someone and been really upset to realize they had some really blatant similarity to my mother. And you may have that same experience. The Electra conflict is focused on women, of course, and it uses the term penis envy. And the hypothesis there was that having a baby would get rid of that penis envy by being a penis substitute for the female. Uh, if either the Oedipus complex or Electra conflict are not resolved, there would be an unhealthy heterosexual relationship, according to Freud. Um, I guess just in defense of Freud, I'd just say that he had some strange ideas, really, really strange. But at the heart and root of a lot of his ideas, there is some actual sense, some rationale that could be used. So um, I wouldn't say throw everything out just because he said some messed up stuff. His daughter, Anna Freud, would later study ego psychology, um, which involves the control or delay of instant gratification. And later on, object relations theory would come about and focus on interactions with real or imagined other people. The object being the symbolic representation of another person, like a parent. And then introjection, which is the incorporation of important objections or objects into personality. Um, a borderline personality disorder, a person with that borderline personality disorder, cannot incorporate or resolve other objects. They cannot do this introjection. Okay, so here we have a lot of perspectives on psychology. We're going to start with Adler, the interpersonal perspective. Um, Adler talked about maladaptive tendencies with environment and society and the need for a group. Adler also said that our personalities were formed via birth order effects. We're going to mention Erikson's 7 stages here, which you see in this graphic on the right. I'm not going to get into that in detail, but really, really cool. It's gonna if you take developmental psychology, you're gonna get into that much more in detail. Um, Attachment theory was another interpersonal perspective. That was by Bowlby. Um, of course, Freud had the first systematic approach to how psychological processes worked to affect mental disorders. So that's really cool, really important. The first systematic approach to how our thoughts, our psychological processes worked to result in mental disorders. Of course, he used free association and dream analysis um, with the idea that not all causes are obvious. Again, 3 main things he focused on: the unconscious, childhood experiences, and sex. Mental disorders are the result of exaggerations of normal coping. Okay, and we're going to look at the behavioral perspective, which was basically a result of people wanting to be more scientific, and it was more scientific. Learning was the modification of behavior as a result of experience. Classical conditioning um, became popular, and we'll focus on that in psychology of learning if you take that course. Classical conditioning involves the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli, the unconditioned and conditioned responses, and then the neutral stimulus. Um, and then other after learning, we might talk about extinction and spontaneous recovery. We actually do things about these stimuli and reinforcements in what's called stimulus-stimulus expectancy. So really what I want you to take from this little tidbit is to think about how you have been conditioned, if at all. Think about that. I'm a huge advocate for you applying things to your own life so you recall them. As part of that, instrumental, which is also called operant conditioning, involves reinforcements or punishments. With reinforcement, we have a response outcome expectancy, which is prone to extinction, but not with conditioned avoidance response. We might look at generalization. You may want to look up Little Albert, the study with Little Albert, versus discrimination. So understanding that sometimes we think generalization means, I had a bad experience with a redhead, so now I won't date anybody who's redheaded. Or we may realize, oh, I had a bad experience with a redhead named Sam. I'll understand that it was really more about who the person was and not the name or the color of their hair. And that would be more discriminating the cause, rather than generalizing it to all redheads or all people named Sam. Observational learning, we're going to talk about Bandura here. Bandura did some research with a Bobo doll in which an adult would be aggressive or violent towards a inflatable doll, and children who are watching that would observe and learn, thus the name observational learning, and they would, when allowed to play with the Bobo doll, they would exhibit the same sort of behavior. Then we're going to get into this third area, cognitive behavioral theory or therapy. And that's a good thing to point out, is that the theory has become a very prominent therapy in today's world. It involves how our thoughts and the process of information becomes distorted. We have maladaptive emotions and behavior. A schema is a representation of knowledge that guides further acquisition. And this schema can be about the world, or about ourselves, which is a self-schema, who we are and what to expect, effective and organized behavior. If we have the schema that crazy is normal, we might result in psychopathology. So if you live in a really unhealthy home with poor boundaries or unhealthy dynamics, you may come to think that that is a normal situation, and that may lead you to psychopathology. Anxious people are more likely to notice threats. Depressed people are more likely to notice negative things in their environment. When we make an attribution, we're assigning causes or responsibility for things that have happened. Why does a guy buy a date's dinner? Is it because he wants to be chivalrous, to be a gentleman? Or is it because he wants sex? Why do you fall asleep in my class? I may make that attribution. I may try to discover an attribution and say, oh, it's because you had a really tough night last night and you're just tired. Or I may make the attribution that I am boring and thus you fell asleep. Attributions can be internal or external, stable or unstable, and specific or global. We often have a self-serving bias that protects ourselves. We like to, normally, if we're healthier, to some degree, depressives will blame themselves a lot, but otherwise we have a tendency to blame other people before ourselves. Cognitive therapy was developed by Beck, and so we had thoughts or cognitions that produce maladaptive emotions and behavior. We evaluate our own, he trained people to evaluate their own self-statements and consider alternatives. A woman who recently broke up with somebody might say, "I'll never be happy again." And he might ask her to consider the alternative or to find her own alternative of, it may be a while before I'm happy again, but I'm unhappy now, and there is a possibility I can be happy again. This, in terms of therapy, is called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the current most popular type of therapy. If an experience is predictable and or controllable, it is less stress-inducing. So we have four categories of psychological causal factors or antecedents: early deprivation or trauma, inadequate parenting styles, marital discord and divorce, and maladaptive peer relationships. We're going to go over those pretty quickly. Early deprivation or trauma could have to do with food, shelter, love, attention. We may look into orphanages, which is institutionalization. There's less warmth there and physical contact, less stimulation, less encouragement. Of course, nowadays we try to put kids in foster homes or adoptive homes. Neglect and abuse can be emotional, physical, or sexual. It leads to disorganized and disoriented styles of attachment. Insecurity, inconsistent behavior with primary caregivers, and it generalizes, unfortunately, into the future, into new relationships. So it's cyclical. Now, you've heard the idea that those who are abused become abusers later in life. That's often due to not having learned healthy attachment styles. Um, when we talk about parenting, we're going to talk about that it's bidirectional. Some kids are more difficult and they'll affect how the parents treat them. We have a predisposition or vulnerability that may be genetic and environmental. We're going to look at four types of parenting, uh, and it basically all is a shift of warmth and control. So the authoritative type of parent is warm but careful. They set healthy boundaries and limits. If you want to if you are a parent or if you want to be a parent, authoritative is the way to go if you can learn how to do it. Warm but careful. And you'll see there are problems with all these others to some extent. Authoritarian is very controlling. High control, low warmth. Leads to conflicted, irritability, um, and moody children. The permissive parent has very high warmth but low control over their children. Leads to impulsive children and later adults, and often aggressive children. The fourth type of parent is neglectful or uninvolved. They have low warmth and also low control. That's probably the worst type. Um, I'd say probably the most damaging, with authoritarian being the second worst, permissive being the third worst, and then authoritative is, in my opinion, the best. We're going to mention that marital discord and divorce are really important. We need to learn negative interaction styles um, um, as key determinants of marital discord and divorce. The adults are not interacting in healthy or positive ways. Divorced families, some adults never recover or fully recover from a divorce. And you may stop and think now, how many of you that are listening to this have been affected by marital discord or divorce, either in your own adulthood or as a child? Children of divorce often feel insecurity, rejection, but remember, temperament affects parents. So the children may have already had problems. Unfortunately, when we say the children, it's not your fault. It's not always 100% true. Um, the death of a child, for instance, the temperament of a child can play and it can have an influence on the health of the marriage. Um, Finally, we're going to talk about maladaptive peer relationships. We're talking about loners, we're talking about bullies, and we're going to introduce, of course, in our culture, cyberbullying as being something bullies do. There are two types of rejected kids: the withdrawn kid and the aggressive kid, basically the passive and the active kid. I want you to stop and think for a moment, if you will, about why does our society like to cyberbully? Why has that become a trend? Of course, technology is there now. Some of the, our environment has was never virtual before, but there's also the issue of anonymity. Um, so socialization leads to varying levels of social competence. We have the socio-cultural viewpoint. It says that we are products of our society. Most disorders are universal to all cultures, although it has different patterns in each culture, rates, and manifestations. There are some cultures that vary. Thailand is known to be a rather over-controlled society, whereas the United States is an under-controlled society. Of course, socioeconomic status and disorders interact. Antisocial personality disorder is more common in lower socioeconomic status individuals. Also, lower SES leads to more stressors and less resources, which can ultimately lead to more deviancy, lower IQ, unemployment issues. Minorities have increased psychological distress and more discrimination. Women um, often have to deal with mixed roles. Who they're expected to be, a mother and a worker, and having multiple identities can increase problems. Um, Social change and uncertainty play a role. Stress and other things, rapid, inconsistent change, um, and fear. 9/11 can lead to major problems, things like that. Um, Urban environments with more violence, deviance, mental disorders, homelessness, and gangs. Um, Better mental health treatment from similar ethnic groups is really important. Um, so these are all things to think about as we are studying this chapter. Um, if you thought I sort of glanced over these things, I went quickly. Causal factors and viewpoints. You are absolutely correct. There are some things that I will I will pull out of there and say you really need to know these. But overall, I want you to listen to the conversation that I had with you, and here are the main messages, and pick those out. Um, Pay attention to those. Part of your job as a student is to learn to predict or predict the information that is most important, and predict the information that you will be tested on. I will help with that, of course, and not leave you completely in the dark. Um, but you need to think about, well, what did Dr. Goodin spend the most time on? What did he seem um, to emphasize more than other things? Thank you very much. I will see you next time.